It began with lace, delicate as spun breath, threaded in gold, draped over bruised skin. A crown of jasmine wilted above trembling eyes. The boy stood still, dressed in bridal silk, his ribs pressing against the tight corset that crushed his breath into silence. Beneath layers of ceremony and musk, his body bore the pale indentations of restraint, wrists encircled not by bangles, but by the ghost of leather. He was a vision of obedience, sculpted in terror, presented not to a groom, but to a monarch who ruled not with justice, but with appetite. In the moonlit courtyard of the imperial harem, surrounded by eunuchs and veiled women, the child was paraded like an offering to a temple that had forgotten its god. The air reeked of perfumed rot, clove oil masking blood, incense veiling dread. He was 13, perhaps younger, a foreign tongue forced into Ottoman vowels, renamed, reborn, remade for pleasure. The ceremony was conducted with all the ritual of a wedding and all the agony of a sacrifice. They called it honor. They called it loyalty. But it was neither. It was a consummation of sovereignty and submission, staged beneath lanterns that flickered like eyelids refusing to close. Somewhere, a stringed instrument played a trembling note, too fragile to survive the silence that followed. The boy did not cry, not because he lacked grief, but because grief had become language itself. We tell this story not to disturb you, but to remember those the world silenced in gold. To those watching, wherever you are, know this. We tell it because we love you, because the past must be named, even when its name is unbearable. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee, and let's get started. The empire had long grown decadent on conquest, its sultans feasting on gold and blood, veiled in divine right and silken shadow. By the 17th century, the Ottoman court had become a theater of grotesque ritual, where power was no longer declared on the battlefield, but sculpted in secret chambers behind perfumed curtains and sealed gates. The Topkapi Palace in Istanbul was a world unto itself, sprawling, ornate, and festering. It was said that its domes echoed not with prayer, but with whispered bargains, muffled weeping, and the rustle of veils being drawn. The harem, that forbidden sanctum of feminine rule and male humiliation, stretched like a gilded cage within the palace walls. It was not merely a house of concubines, but a labyrinth of influence, a place where women, castrated men, and child courtiers became pawns in dynastic survival. The Valide Sultan, mother to the reigning ruler, often held more power than any vizier, her voice shaping the fate of empires through the placement of a single girl or boy into her son's bedchamber. Born in the borderlands of the empire's fringes, the boy had no name until he was renamed by his captors. Like many, he was a spoil of war, one of thousands taken during the empire's insatiable advance through the Balkans. His village, like so many, had been raised not for military gain, but for tribute. Youths with symmetrical faces, compliant eyes, and the vulnerability of the conquered. He was selected by a janissary captain not for strength, but for softness. Hair like burnt copper, eyes that dropped when spoken to. Skin pale enough to bruise easily. He was a blank page upon which cruelty could write. At first, he was sent to the Enderun, the palace school that trained Christian boys, converted to Islam in the ways of Ottoman bureaucracy, warcraft, and servitude. The system, called devshirme, was lauded as a meritocracy of blood. But beneath the surface, many of these children were rechanneled, siphoned from the classrooms and sparring halls into the harem's darker wings. There, among women who had not seen the sun in years, and eunuchs who had once dreamed of fatherhood, the boy was taught to sing in languages he did not understand, to walk with ankles grazing like reeds in wind, and to conceal his fear behind kohl-lined eyes. He did not rise through brilliance or cunning. He was chosen for stillness, for the eerie, pliable silence he wore like a shroud. The Sultan, newly enthroned, was already rumored to possess tastes that frightened even the jaded inhabitants of Topkapi. Unlike his predecessors, who preferred the spoils of war, this ruler preferred the illusion of innocence. His chambers remained locked most hours of the day. Servants entered backwards, never lifting their gaze. What occurred behind those ivory doors was never spoken of aloud. It was in this political silence that the boy became a bride, not through proposal or procession, but by decree. The valide Sultan, desiring to protect her power from competing concubines, offered him as an answer to her son's loneliness or perhaps his sickness. It was a decision wrapped in perfume and poison. To be placed in the Sultan's favor was both elevation and obliteration. It meant the protection of proximity and the annihilation of identity. He was bathed in goat's milk and dressed in garments once worn by royal daughters. His hair was oiled with rose water and braided with strands of gold. On the night of his presentation, the palace musicians played a solemn rhythm meant to evoke celestial harmony, but every note sounded like mourning. The women who dressed him did not meet his eyes. The eunuchs who led him to the Sultan's door walked in silence. No one explained the ritual. No one questioned it. They had all witnessed too many disappearances to pretend surprise. This was not an age of innocence. It was an age of ornamented horrors, ritualized cruelty, and sovereign hunger masquerading as divinity. In a court that prayed 5 times a day and sinned 10 times before noon, the boy was not the first to be unmade beneath velvet sheets, but he would become one of the few to be remembered. His story, though, mutilated by time and censorship, survived in fragments. A sketch here, a rumor there, a diary entry smuggled in the folds of a dying scribe's robe. For what he endured, there was no title, no term in any imperial decree, but history would come to call him what the palace dared not speak aloud: the boy, bride of the Sultan. The palace was a mausoleum of breathless obedience. It did not echo with laughter, but with the soft-footed urgency of servants trained to leave no trace. For the boy, it became both cradle and crypt. The day he was led into the Sultan's chamber as a bride was not the day he lost his childhood. It was the day his mind began to fracture under the unbearable weight of pretending he never had one. At first, he floated above it all. Dissociation became his shield, his mind retreating to imagined gardens beyond the Bosphorus, where waterfowl called across clean air and no one touched without love. His body learned to obey on its own, performing rituals of presence while his mind hid in the folds of silence. He learned the etiquette of agony, how to arch when summoned, how to smile when bruised, how to bleed without sound. The Sultan, capricious and fevered, praised him not for passion, but for stillness, calling him his little ghost. The boy could feel himself thinning, not in body, but in soul. He was becoming an outline. The name given to him at birth had long been extinguished. Even the name assigned by the palace was rarely used. He was referred to in epithets, in metaphors, in sighs. He was the swan, the pearl, the offering. He was never he, only it. A possession suspended in ceremonial time. His former language, his native tongue, eroded from his mind like waves dissolving salt. He began to think only in the Sultan's language. Even his prayers were no longer his own. He was allowed no mirrors. But in the burnished plates of polished silver, he caught glimpses of something uncanny. A face not yet fully formed, eyes that seemed borrowed from someone older, someone who had suffered longer. He began to avoid those surfaces, afraid of seeing something that would confirm what he felt, that he was becoming a creature of myth, not memory. His body began to change, not just from age, but from the manipulations of the palace. He was fed strange herbs said to still the maturation of manhood. His skin remained soft, his voice never deepened. Some believed it was done to preserve his aesthetic appeal, but there were whispers it was to prevent rebellion. A eunuch who desired nothing was easier to control than a man who remembered desire. Yet the cruelest part was not the chemicals. They could only dull nature. The true mutilation occurred in the psyche. Every touch from the Sultan left an imprint that echoed for days. The boy could not sleep without hearing footsteps in his dreams, the thud of heavy doors closing behind him, the scent of oud oil and sweat and spoiled rose water. He began to lose time, to forget what month it was, what season. His meals were regulated, his conversations scripted. Even his dreams were invaded. He would awaken drenched in cold sweat, convinced he had heard the Sultan whispering to him in the dark, though no one was there. He was not permitted companionship. Other harem members envied or feared him. Some attempted to reach out, but were punished. Affection became a liability. Love was an act of rebellion. He spoke most often to the eunuch who had first dressed him, an older man with eyes like extinguished stars. Once, the man pressed a small piece of charcoal into his palm and said only, "Write before your mind forgets the shape of your voice." So the boy wrote. Not letters, not pleas, but symbols, curved lines that resembled nothing, scribbles that looked like screams. He hid them beneath floor tiles, inside rolled silks, behind the loose bricks near the fountain. It was not communication, it was exorcism. But madness, once stirred, does not go quietly. It arrived not with fury, but with gentle erosion. He began to feel watched, even in solitude. He spoke aloud to no one and answered back in whispers. He began to see reflections where there were none, to feel hands on his back when he was alone. He would stare at his own limbs for hours, uncertain they belonged to him. And sometimes, in the darkest moments, he would press a sharpened hairpin against his skin just to remind himself he could still bleed. The Sultan grew increasingly erratic. His affections turned cruel, his interest waxing and waning with the tide of his whims. He would shower the boy in rubies one night, and the next ignore him for days, leaving him curled on cold marble in a chamber without candles. The boy came to dread both the opulence and the absence. There was no safety in favor, no solace in being forgotten. He developed rituals to keep the chaos at bay. He would wash his hands 7 times before entering the Sultan's room. He would arrange the folds of his robes precisely. He would hum a song he barely remembered from childhood, something about a river and birds and the moon, until the rhythm calmed his pulse. But even these habits began to fray. One night he forgot the words. Another, he washed until his skin peeled. By the 2nd year, he had begun to refer to himself in the 3rd person. "The boy is tired," he would whisper to the fountain. "The boy is cold." He no longer used I. He no longer believed there was anyone left inside him to speak in the 1st person. And yet, deep beneath the ruins of his stolen identity, a sliver of will remained. It was not hope. He had none. It was not rage. He had buried that long ago. It was memory, ossified and shrouded in silence. He remembered the name his mother once called him. He remembered the sound of his father's axe splitting wood. He remembered the scent of pine on a mountain that now existed only in fragments. And in remembering, he suffered. But in suffering, he remained human. That humanity, so deeply buried, would one day rise, if not in body, then in consequence. For what is denied, a voice does not vanish. It festers, it waits, and eventually it returns. The hour of reckoning unfolded with a cruel inevitability, as if the very walls of the palace conspired to elongate the boy's final torment. It was not a sudden end, but a drawn-out unraveling, a spectacle carved in deliberate agony, where time slowed to the pulse of a distant drum and the scent of charred flesh crept through shadowed corridors. The sovereign's wrath, once veiled in whispered threats, now bled openly, a grotesque theater of decay enacted behind locked doors that held their silence like a tomb. The boy, no longer a child nor truly a man, was summoned before dawn. His steps faltered on the cold marble, each footfall a hesitant echo swallowed by the emptiness of the corridor. His skin, once a canvas of delicate promise, was now mottled with bruises. Deep purple, sickly yellow, the grotesque map of a body betrayed. His wrists bore fresh abrasions, cruelly ritualized like scars of honor in a war no one dared name. They bound him not with ropes, but with chains lined in velvet, a mockery of gentility. His captors wore faces devoid of compassion. The eunuch's eyes, once indifferent, now gleamed with the lust of finality. The women of the harem, hidden behind silk veils, held their breath in darkened galleries, their whispers extinguished before they could bloom. Outside, the palace stirrings gave way to a muted dread. The usual bustle of servants and guards was replaced by an unnatural stillness, as if the empire itself recoiled from the impending spectacle. The boy was brought to the Hall of Justice, a cavernous chamber where the marble floor was stained with the faded ghosts of past executions. The air was thick with the coppery tang of old blood and burnt oil. Torches flickered unevenly, casting long, trembling shadows that danced like restless spirits along the domed ceiling. Here, the boy was laid upon a stone slab, cold as the grave, his body stretched out like a sacrificial lamb beneath the gaze of 1,000 unseen eyes. The Sultan entered, robed in midnight silk embroidered with silver crescents. His face was a mask of icy disdain, eyes glinting with something darker than hatred. An unsettling hunger that sought to consume rather than destroy. He carried a blade, not the heavy executioner's axe common to the realm, but a slender, curved yataghan, its edge honed to a whisper. This choice was itself a statement. Precision over brutality, ritual over chaos. The boy's gaze met the Sultan's for the briefest moment, a flicker of recognition that was quickly extinguished. No mercy was offered. This was not mercy. This was precision. The execution began not with the stroke of the blade, but with a slow, unbearable tearing apart of the boy's world. He was stripped of his bridal silks, each fabric layer peeled away like the shedding of a fragile skin. His body, pale and trembling, was exposed beneath the flickering torchlight. The air, thick with incense moments before, now reeked of sweat and fear. His limbs were bound to the stone slab, wrists and ankles fastened with iron shackles that bit into flesh already raw. The crowd beyond the hall, court officials, janissaries, and the Sultan's closest confidants, watched in stony silence, a public spectacle of control and spectacle where the line between justice and cruelty blurred into shadow. The Sultan raised the yataghan. The boy's breath hitched, a ragged sound swallowed almost immediately by the vaulted chamber. The blade descended with surgical grace, slicing first through the silk binding the boy's chest, then grazing the skin in a shallow ceremonial cut meant to bleed, but not kill. It was a ritual, a prelude to finality that transformed death into theater. For hours, the boy remained suspended in agony. His blood, slow and dark, traced delicate patterns upon the cold stone, a macabre tapestry that whispered of erasure and martyrdom. The Sultan's attendants carried out acts of ritualized degradation. The boy's hair was singed with a burning coal, his nails clipped and collected as grim trophies, and his entrails, once loosened by alchemical poisons, were ceremonially burned in a brazier to symbolize the purging of sin. Each act was punctuated by silence so thick it suffocated, broken only by the boy's shallow gasps and the crackling fire that consumed his flesh as remnants. The crowd remained motionless, their faces etched with the ossified expression of those who witness horror too often to flinch. There was no weeping. There was no lamentation. There was only the cold mechanics of power exercised without conscience. The boy's mind, once a fragile sanctuary, shattered beneath the weight of slow death. He drifted in and out of consciousness, caught between fevered visions of home and the oppressive reality of his unmaking. Shadows took on monstrous shapes, whispered voices echoed from empty corners, and the very stones beneath him seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his fading heart. At one point, the Sultan stepped closer, his face inches from the boy's pale cheek. He pressed the blade gently to the boy's throat, not to cut, but to mark the final surrender. The boy's eyes fluttered, tears unshed, lips parted in a silent scream. The Sultan traced a line of blood like a dark signature, sealing the boy's fate in ritualistic defiance of mercy. The final stroke came as dawn's first light breached the palace windows. The yataghan's edge found its mark with a whisper, severing not just flesh, but the fragile tether between existence and oblivion. The boy's body went limp, a vessel emptied yet still exuding the spectral scent of roses crushed beneath boots. But even death was not swift release. The body was sealed in a lead coffin, its cold metal casing a tomb within a tomb. The lead was meant to silence the boy's legacy, to prevent the corruption of sacred ground with his tainted blood. Yet in this act of attempted erasure, the boy's memory was transmuted into something more haunting, a lingering echo in the annals of empire, a ghost that refused to be contained. This was not mercy. This was precision. The news of the boy's demise slipped through the palace walls like a slow poison, seeping into the veins of the empire's heart and staining its golden facade with whispered dread. To the court, his death was a necessity cloaked in silence, a cleansing of an inconvenient truth, a shadow excised to preserve the illusion of sovereign purity. Yet, beneath the rigid protocols of mourning, a trembling undercurrent pulsed through the corridors, fragile and barely spoken, but undeniable in its presence. Outside the marble gates, the city whispered rumors that rippled through bazaars and alleys like a bitter wind. Merchants lowered their voices when the boy's name was uttered. Mothers hushed children who dared ask why a boy had been wed like a bride to a sultan, only to vanish beneath the weight of palace secrets. The public spectacle of the execution was known to a select few, but its resonance echoed far beyond the halls of power. In taverns, in marketplaces, in quiet homes, the story unfolded in fractured narratives, each fragment stained with a mixture of horror, fascination, and forbidden sympathy. Among the janissaries, the boy's death became a symbol of the empire's unraveling. Veterans who had witnessed countless battles spoke in hushed tones about the palace's rot, about power consumed not by conquest, but by paranoia and ritualized cruelty. The Devshirme system, once lauded as a mechanism of merit and loyalty, was now questioned in whispers. Was this the empire's future? Sacrificing its youth in gilded cages to feed the insatiable appetites of men crowned by blood and fear? The Valid Sultan, architect of the boy's fate, maintained her stoic facade, yet those closest to her noticed a subtle erosion in her composure. The loss of her favored instrument in palace politics weakened her grasp on influence, exposing fissures in the delicate balance of power she had so meticulously maintained. Rival factions within the court began to stir, emboldened by the vacancy left in the boy's absence. The harem, once a fortress of quiet submission, convulsed beneath the strain of shifting allegiances and whispered betrayals. For the common people, the boy's story became a grim parable of innocence consumed by empire, an unspoken lament that grew heavier with each retelling. His face, though never displayed in public, became a ghostly emblem among those who dared remember. In shadowed corners of the city, children mimicked his measured steps, cloaked in borrowed silks and haunted by an unknowable sorrow. Mothers sang lullabies that carried the boy's name in coded verses, a ritual of remembrance passed in secret. Yet the empire itself moved forward with cruel indifference. The official record spoke of no tragedy, no martyrdom. The boy was erased from the annals, consigned to oblivion by decree and lead. His death was a footnote beneath the Sultan's flourishing reign, a carefully hidden wound beneath the empire's radiant veneer. The public spectacle had been a controlled performance, designed to remind all who witnessed that power was absolute, and mercy a forgotten myth. And still, beneath the surface, the echo lingered. Like the scent of burnt rose on a cold breeze, the memory of the boy bride haunted those who had witnessed the ritual, those who had seen innocence transformed into a grotesque symbol of empire's appetite. It was a secret shared in silence, a wound never fully healed, a story passed not in words, but in the tremble of a hand, the hesitation of a glance. This was not closure. This was erasure met with resistance. He was never given a tomb. No marble marker stood in his memory. No calligraphed epitaph mourned his departure. Yet the absence itself became an inscription, etched into the stone silence of the Topkapi Palace and carried like a chill through generations who dared remember what the empire refused to name. The boy bride, extinguished in life, flourished in legend. Historians, when permitted to speak freely, would later call him an anomaly, an aberration of a decadent court in its twilight. But those who studied more closely, who brushed dust from forgotten letters and read between the lines of censored scrolls, understood that he was not an anomaly at all. He was the symbol of something far more damning, an empire that had turned its sacred rituals inward, consuming its children to sustain its hollow pageantry. In the centuries that followed, his memory became a cipher for the hidden victims of empire. Poets wrote of him without using his name, calling him the Bride of Silence, the Moon Without a Grave, or the Boy of the Burning Veil. His image appeared in secret etchings, a slim figure clad in bridal silk, eyes downcast, standing at the mouth of a fire that licked at the hem of an empire's conscience. Painters who worked in hushed defiance placed his likeness in corner shadows of religious scenes, his expression a quiet accusation amid gilded saints and triumphant kings. Among the descendants of the Janissaries, his story passed like a warning of what loyalty demanded, of how beauty could be weaponized, and how submission could be enforced with enough incense and steel. Some claimed his soul still lingered in the palace, drifting between the chambers where he once wept, heard only by those who suffered in similar silence. There were tales of a soft voice singing foreign lullabies through keyholes, or the scent of jasmine blooming unnaturally in winter. In a later century, when foreign dignitaries began to tour the old Ottoman halls, a French scholar documented a room curiously sealed behind a marble arch. No records explained its closure. No servant could name its purpose, but all knew to bow slightly when passing by, as if the space itself held memory. It was the room, he would learn, where the boy had last been dressed in his bridal silks, a room that had not been opened in over 100 years. The symbolism of his death outlasted the empire that crushed him. His story became a mirror held up to every court that ever consumed its young under the guise of piety or power. And though few knew the full truth, fewer still could deny the heaviness that hung over the tale. In the boy, they saw not only the collapse of moral sovereignty, but the perversion of ritual itself. What had been sacred, marriage, ceremony, ascension, had become profane. The boy's life was twisted into a spectacle, his death into theater, his body into allegory. To some, he became a saint of silence, not in doctrine, but in defiance. He symbolized those who could not scream, who were made into ornaments of pain. And to others, he was an omen of what unfolds when empire ceases to serve the soul and begins to feed on it instead. His erasure was meant to cauterize a wound, but it became the wound's echo instead. No empire lasts forever. Stones crumble, domes collapse, sultans die unloved in palaces too vast for memory. But sometimes the nameless endure longer than the crowned. Not because their lives were celebrated, but because their suffering refuses to be buried. The boy bride had no heir, no voice left behind. But his story passed like incense, bitter, invisible, and unforgettable. And in that scent, something sacred lingered. History, when left to emperors, prefers to forget. It smooths over cruelty with pageantry, buries pain beneath imperial gold, and silences the breath of those who were never meant to speak. But the boy bride did not vanish, not truly. He lived in the soft rebellion of memory, in the tremor beneath the empire's grandeur, in the unswept corners of the palace where no prayers could drown out the weeping. His death became more than an atrocity. It became a wound that never clotted, festering beneath the skin of legacy. For in him, the empire had crucified not just a child, but the illusion of its moral supremacy. The rituals that cloaked his erasure, the bridal silks, the music, the velvet restraints, were not forgettable ornaments, but instruments of desecration. And no amount of lead, no sealing of coffins or tearing of records could undo the symbolism of what had been done. The palace itself remembered. In later years, when revolts stirred and dynasties shifted, those who wandered the marble halls late at night reported strange phenomena. The sound of anklets across stone with no body to wear them. Wilted jasmine appearing in locked rooms, a thin trail of blood blooming from beneath a sealed door. Servants spoke of a presence not malevolent, but unbearably sorrowful, as though grief itself had found form and refused to leave. In time, even poets grew cautious. His image, once a cipher for quiet suffering, became too dangerous. A whisper too close to treason. One dared to write, he was not a prince, yet his crown was agony. He was not a bride, yet his wedding was slaughter. The manuscript was destroyed. The poet vanished, but the line remained. Scrawled in the margins of other texts, memorized by those who still dared to name what had been done. Some tried to repurpose the boy's legacy, to cleanse it, to frame his death as tragic but necessary, as a relic of a crueler age now buried. But these efforts failed, for the boy's story did not lend itself to redemption. There was no noble ending, no martyr's crown, only the still, airless truth of a child offered up in silence, his screams absorbed by velvet walls and imperial indifference. He was not mourned, he was erased, and yet he remained. Not as a ghost to be feared, but as a question left unanswered. What does power become when it no longer serves justice? What happens to beauty when it is devoured by authority? What is sovereignty if it feeds on silence? Every empire crafts its myths. The Ottoman Empire was no different. It sang of crescent moons, of divine right, of golden conquest and divine favor. But in its shadow stood the boy bride, unnamed, unseen, and unforgettable. He was not a myth. He was the cost. And even centuries later, the question of his existence pierces through the gauze of time. Was he real, or merely the echo of many silenced voices, compressed into one unbearable legend? The answer matters little. For the feeling he leaves behind, cold, heavy, and unrelenting, is as real as the marble he bled upon. In modern Istanbul, Topkapı still stands. Tourists marvel at its beauty, take photographs beneath the same arches that once reverberated with the quiet sobs of a forgotten child. But if one listens closely, in the silence between camera shutters and docent whispers, something else emerges. A trace of breath, a memory unburied. Not all who were buried in Lead stay buried.